Today is January 25th, 2021, 3 p.m., and we're here for the Public Works and Finance Committee. We have 3 items on the agenda. So the very first one is approval of the January 11th, 2021 minutes. Are there any questions, corrections?
Nope, they look good to me.
They look good.
Great, they're approved. Okay, the ordinance amending Title V of the Moscow City Code with the addition of Chapter 19. Is Kyle there and Tyler? There, we're both there. Thanks, guys.
I am. Good afternoon, councilors. Can you see and hear me okay?
We can.
All right, just a little bit of background for those that are maybe watching. The city of Moscow was issued a stormwater permit, which became effective on October 1st of 2019. This is a federal permit that was issued by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The permit requires the city to develop and implement a comprehensive stormwater management program throughout the 5-year permit term. So we have, like we discussed last month, we have certain milestones that we have to meet throughout that 5-year permit term. Has been discussed over the last several years and at the council workshop that we held last February, where we discussed the findings of the stormwater user fee study that we conducted with our consultants. The city of Moscow currently has few revenue sources and funding mechanisms to operate the existing stormwater program. Due to increased maintenance and tracking requirements, increasing capital needs, and regulatory compliance responsibilities of the new permit, securing additional funding and implementing the recommendations that were identified in that study is crucial for us to comply with the permit. So before you today is a proposed amendment of Moscow City Code Title V with the addition of Chapter 19. Chapter 19 would allow the city to establish a system of stormwater user fees to fund and carry out the requirements of the permit over the next several years. The stormwater user fees would be collected from customers within the entire incorporated area of the city. And I think it's important to note, we've got a little bit of feedback since our January newsletter that we would only charge fees to properties that actually receive a stormwater service. So those that actually discharge stormwater, whether directly or indirectly, to the city's stormwater control system. The ordinance allows property owners to seek stormwater fee adjustments or possibly the elimination of fees through an application and appeals process. And the ordinance prohibits using the revenue collected to pay for non-stormwater related city costs. If the proposed ordinance is adopted by the council this year, it's anticipated that the city would start assessing fees beginning October 1st. I think it's also important to note, we were questioned about the repercussions of non-compliance, and failure by the city to comply with the permit requirements would subject the city to civil and criminal penalties under federal law. Civil penalties can range up to $37,500 per day per violation. So it's a very serious matter that we comply with our permit, just like we do out at the Water Reclamation and Reuse facility. So that's my presentation. I would stand for any questions. I don't know if Tyler had anything to add, but we'd be willing to stand for any questions.
No, I think Kyle covered it pretty well and pretty comprehensively. I mean, if you'll allow me just an analogy, a long time ago, when we were discharging sewer from people's houses, a lot of places in the country, they just discharged raw sewage straight into a waterway, whether that be the ocean, river, or lake. And over time, regulation increased, and that required an increase in regulatory activities that ultimately led to cleaned up systems, cleaning up the natural environment, making sure that our impact on the natural environment is minimized to the maximum extent possible. This is in line with that. This is the first stormwater permit the city's been issued. So the activities that we've engaged in up to this point with regards to storm have been largely reactionary. While we've engaged in some activities like street sweeping that certainly help with stormwater quality, there are a lot of activities and the provisions in this permit that are brand new to us and new requirements to us. And so it's a big task, setting up something like this, but it's also something that we're excited to engage in and think that it'll be worthwhile as we try to minimize our impact on Paradise Creek.
Any questions, Art?
So with that, we'd be happy to field any questions y'all might have.
Yeah, no questions for me. I've heard the presentation a couple of times now, so I feel pretty up to date on it. And I want to emphasize, though, that this is not something the city has initiated of its own volition. These are requirements that have been handed down to us by the EPA that we have to comply with. We don't have a lot of choice. And so the response is necessitated the creation of the stormwater utility.
Ann, do you have any questions? Can't hear you, Ann.
Muted, Ann.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say I appreciate that comment because I feel like the word permit sometimes connotes that you go out and apply for something, which this wasn't the case, right? It was issued. So I think I brought this up before, but I get asked every once in a while about rain barrels and if we would ever subsidize those or incorporate that in. It's a different program than our water saving tools, but is that something that would ever be viable for us to look into?
So, and we've looked at rain barrels from a couple different perspectives. One from the water conservation standpoint to consider if that was something that we would want to consider adding to the suite of water conservation devices for which we provide some sort of rebate. And then as the storm program evolves, there are different components that we can look at, that we can start to look at. Our initial focus is really going to be on meeting the tenets of the permit. We've got a very condensed period of time. Kyle and his staff and Steve Schulte and a few other folks really did a masterful job in compressing our implementation of this utility. As you all know, we had intended to try and push this forward a year ago, but with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the council, I think, wisely made the decision to push this off. But that did necessitate us really compressing a lot of things into a short period of time. So the first 3 years, we're going to be scrambling to try and meet the provisions. But once we're clear of that and get our processes set up, get some staff on board that are working on these things, I think those are things that we can take a look at different provisions. Kyle, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No. Because it would affect somebody's contribution to stormwater runoff, right? Depending on how they were utilized.
It potentially could. Yeah, there are direct and indirect impacts on the stormwater system. But yeah, if somebody is detaining the runoff on the property, that could have an impact on their contribution to the storm system.
That's my only question. I just want to kind of keep that on the radar because again, I get asked about it quite a bit and it's an interesting idea to me. But no, that was it for me.
So I guess
there are a couple of things, if you'll allow me, Maureen, that I do want to emphasize. One of the things that Art said that I think is really important is that we really these are things that we're required to do. And as we formulated the proposal for this, and as we've worked with our consultant going through this, the first cut at it is, all right, how do we do this? And let's put together, okay, what's all the stuff that we need? I can tell you right now that as we went through that process, our instructions from the mayor, from the council, from City Supervisor Gary Reedner from the get-go was, there's no gold plating on this thing. We are going to be as efficient as we can, and we are going to cut back and cut back and cut back until we're doing what we need to do and doing it well. But there's no fluff, and so it's something that we really took seriously, and we have cut back and cut back and cut back and really tried to get it down to just the core things that we've got to be doing to make sure that we meet the tenets of this permit.
this is kind of a follow-up to Ann's question, and that is the educational component, telling people whether it's a rain collection bucket or whatever it is, ways that people can decrease their the usage. and their fee?
One of the things that was important to us, Ann, is we wanted to make sure that we really did try and capture that. Now, there is, as with any utility, when we're dealing with thousands of accounts, infinite variability becomes impossible. And so one of the things that we did up front that not every city has done is when we come forward, the proposal that we'll be bringing forward to the council for structure doesn't just have a single residential rate for all residential properties, because we wanted to recognize that there are certain residential properties that may have a lot more impervious surface than other residential properties. So we actually broke it into 3 tiers, a low, medium, and high for those properties in trying to capture that. And then on the commercial end, it'll be an actual calculation of the exact amount of impact. So it'll be, you might have 1.5 equivalent residential units, ERUs. And so it is something that we've really tried to make this as equitable as we can right out of the gate.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, we with our consultants, we did quite a bit of work looking at direct dischargers that directly discharge to Hog Creek or the South Fork Palouse River, those parcels that are, within close proximity to these water bodies. And we've already applied a credit to those, and we're calling it a direct discharge credit. And so there's about 150 properties, non-residential and commercial, that we've already taken a really close look at that. And what we hope to do with the rollout is work with staff and property owners to make sure that those direct discharge credits are being applied where warranted.
And in addition to that, Maureen, on the education component, we are starting direct outreach to some of the more impacted properties in town. And so we will be having one-on-one meetings with them, talking through how much they've got, what they can do, what options they have, and really making sure that we're educating on that front. In addition, you may have seen in our latest utility billing newsletter, we had another blast out about the utility and giving people contact information. We'll have a very robust public outreach campaign over the next several months, just making sure everyone's aware. We've got the video that we rolled out on the city's website a couple months ago that we brought to the council. And then we're also incorporating Storm into our public education program that we do in the schools. And so that'll be a big component of what we're going out and doing the education on. We'll be adding an entire component, a Storm component to that, to help start educating the school children of the impacts of the storm system and what it is that we're trying to do.
If I may. This is very similar to the situation we had in the early 1990s when we were first regulated by the EPA for our NPDES permit at the the Water Reclamation and Reuse Facility. And at that point, we had very reasonable, if not very cheap, sewer rates. When we started getting regulated and the EPA indicated, okay, you need to meet these limitations or else you will be fined. At that point, it was about $23,000 a day, I believe. And so the city was very motivated to try and make something happen and invested a significant amount of money. I think we're up well upwards of $20 million into our water reclamation and reuse facility. Just because we want to do the right thing and we want to avoid those fines and meet the regulatory requirements. Similar to what the EPA has done in regulating stormwater. So it's just an evolution. We will get better at doing stormwaters. We know more about it. We've learned from sometimes mistakes, sometimes successes of other regulated agencies and cities. So this ordinance and the program has been developed with best practices in mind. But there's no doubt that there will be a startup cost. We'll keep the cost as reasonable as possible. But again, as Tyler and Kyle both said, the problem with not meeting those regulations is the EPA will regulate us with fines, if nothing else. So I'm very impressed with the program. The Environmental Services Group has done a great job in formulating it, and Tyler and his group have put together a utility that makes sense and passes on the cost of the discharge of stormwater onto those properties which are doing it, and it is adjusted individually, if at all possible, to those properties that are doing it. So it seems like we have all the bases covered, at least at this point.
Any other questions? Proposal?
Well, I think we should just send it on to the full council with a recommendation of approval.
I agree. Ann?
All right, well, we'll see you guys next week with it then.
Thank you. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
all the hard work on this. It's amazing amount of work, and the appeal process and individualizing people's usage. You guys have done an amazing job.
Thank you,
Well,
Maureen.
and if I may, I want to thank Mia for her work with Aspect on the development of this. It's been quite a long time in the making. So Mia's on the call, and I'd like to really thank her and Gary as well. So
No,
you guys-
I want to confirm that, because I believe the fact that Lewiston got sued, and we've really taken our efforts to make sure that we prevent that from happening here, and it was really well laid out. So thank you, Mia, thank you, Gary, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, point number 3, renewal of the agreement for E9911, services and complete dispatch services with Whitcom. Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor. Give me just a moment here to get my stuff together. In case you're wondering, this is the Whitcom file. So it's grown over the years. What we're here today to talk about is a renewal of the Whitcom agreement. I believe Chief Fry is with us virtually, as is Captain Lanier. Are you gentlemen with us?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. The reason that they are with us is, of course, dispatch, emergency dispatch is very important to emergency services, but a little closer to home, as noted, and I know we got some comments from our former mayor, Nancy Cheney, regarding some of the machinations that Whitcom went through over the last couple of years, including some labor issues, losing some dispatchers, having a challenge meeting coverage issues, shift issues. And you'll recall way earlier last spring, when the executive director of Whitcom left that employ, we essentially allowed Captain Lanier, who had experience with dispatch, running a dispatch center when he was with the city of Lewiston, we allowed him to moonlight, if you will, over at a temporary duty assignment to assist Whitcom. And with his assistance and the assistance of Wendy Barrett, who is the current executive director of Whitcom, who is unable to be here today because of previous commitment, they were able to work with the Whitcom board and structure a new management model, if you will, that has addressed those issues of staff turnover, staff longevity, morale, and those sorts of things. So Roger's here to answer any questions if you have anything about that, but I will give a brief history and answer some of the basic questions. As far as history is noted in the CCSR, 2004 was the first year that we contracted with Whitcom. They had 3 entities at that time who were operating together with an intergovernmental interlocal agreement. That would be Whitman County, City of Pullman, and Washington State University. We were approached by Whitcom. It was serendipitous at the time. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Serendipitous at the time because we had got into the E911 emergency services back in the early 1990s. We had purchased a console from Motorola at about $1 million. We had entered into an agreement to have our PSAP, which is all of our addresses so that a number can be associated with the physical location, had to be updated daily, weekly, if not daily. And that was expensive as well. We had a full staff of dispatchers, management, and they were all housed over at the current police department. And that went on pretty well until the turn of the century. About 2000, we started looking at replacing that system. At that point, we had previously obtained grants, and I believe we had, I can't recall the exact funding model in the early 1990s. That was done just before I came on. But when we went back in 2003, I believe, we tried to gain judicial confirmation of what it would take to start a new or replace the existing system. At that time, the district judge looked at our petition, determined that the operation of an E911 system was not an ordinary and necessary expense under the Idaho Constitution. So our choice at that time was to go out to a vote of the people to tax themselves, issue a bond, if you will, to go ahead and purchase the new equipment, which at that time had grown significantly in expense. At that time, we started looking at alternatives. We had a joint dispatch center concept that we were exploring with Latah County, which did not yield fruit. We were then approached by Whitcom, which is the consolidated Whitman County Emergency Dispatch Center, inquiring whether we were interested in contracting with them for those services. So we spent 9 months, I would bet, if not a year. Dan Weaver, who was the chief of police at the time, spearheaded that. I believe that our current Chief Fry was also involved in that. Essentially working with Whitcom to determine if they had the capacity and the wherewithal to provide those dispatch services remotely, if you will, from the dispatch center located over on Hopkins Court in the Whitman County Technology Park. After it was determined that they were able to do that, we negotiated an agreement with Whitcom, and we moved forward with contracting with them for E911 services. At that point, we gave up our dispatch center as we secured employment for those dispatchers who wanted it over at Whitcom. I believe Wendy Barrett, the current executive director of Whitcom, was one of our dispatchers at the time. And we essentially outsourced our dispatch center. And we've been with Whitcom ever since 2004. We've had several agreements. The first one was 2004 to 2011. Excuse me. No, that was the ordinance. I'm sorry. June 2004 to 2007, then 2007 through 2009, then 2010 to 2015, and then 2016 to 2020. When we initially began the program, the cost was about $31,500 per month for an annual of about $376,000. Then it went up, and I'm sorry I missed the middle, the next section, but it looks to be about $400,000 for the next contract, roughly. Then it was approximately $480,000 through 2015. And then there was usually a 3% inflationary factor to the contract. There was not an increase in the cost of it for services, but there was an inflationary factor that went along with it. But this contract has been in place for about 17 years now, 16 years. So going into the final term of the contract is about $578,000. That was a contract that just expired on January 1st of 2021. And as you can see, as you know, we have proposals, which I'll talk about in a minute, for the amounts that we will be contracting for if the council approves the contract. I wanted to note that the initial three members of the interlocal agreement, Whitman County, City of Pullman, and Washington State University, after they invited us, they also invited Asotin County. They had capacity to provide those services to Asotin County. So we are what are known as contract members. So we aren't part of the original three, but we are provided positions on the board. That was done in the 2015 renewal. So we do have a say on the board. Our position before was ex officio. Right now, the position on the board is the city supervisor of the city of Moscow or his or her designee. So the designee at this point is Chief Fry. Again, the current agreement was renewed in 2016 and expired on December 31st, 2020. I note that former Mayor Cheney had some questions as to how did it expire. It did expire. We are not under an agreement right now, continuing to provide services. I've been working with the executive director, Wendy Barrett, for the last 6 months on this agreement. The initial drafts, I believe, went out sometime in November. We went back and forth. And then over the Christmas holidays, we could have brought it forward initially, had it ready for the first meeting in January, but schedules didn't jive at that time. And I will take responsibility for not getting it done. It was on my watch. However, there was no question with Whitcom and their board. They knew we were in negotiations. They knew that the price was taken care of. We were just cleaning up the contract. I did report this back to City Council last June. If you'll recall, I laid out essentially what I'm doing today. The reason I did that at that time was because we were talking about a funding model. One of the reasons that Whitcom was going through some issues with their employees, there were some issues of coverage, turnover. It's a very stressful job and frankly isn't very highly paid. So they were looking at how do you deal with this. So Roger, I think, did a really good job of working with management over there and came up with a model by which the employees were raised in pay to a more competitive salary and given hopefully better working conditions. So those issues, although they haven't gone away completely, are being addressed in a satisfactory fashion. And that was one of the things, as Chief Fry could chime in if he wants to, that gave us a lot of concern was we needed to make sure that we were able to provide that consistent, steady dispatch. So that was one of the reasons that when Whitcom needed a hand from a management standpoint, we were happy to let Captain Lanier give his expertise to that as well. So as far as the history continuing, well over the past year, we've been working together to discuss differing fee structures that would be equitable to everyone. Those issues have gone from a user fee model, from where it's a call volume model, where the entities that provide the most call volume pay an amount per call, if you will. So if you have more calls, you pay more money. That isn't a model that anybody really liked too much because we also have dispatches for our public works folks and for non-emergency dispatch. All of those would go into the call volume. So all of a sudden, if you're an entity that does that, disproportionately your call volume goes up, you pay more money even though it isn't emergency dispatch. So they had another model based on, we talked about, based on population. Was population a viable way of splitting up the costs of Whitcom? And it was determined that that really wasn't the way either, because you had, everybody has to have emergency dispatch no matter what your population is. So it's like having an insurance policy. It's great. You hate to pay it until you need it. And when you need it, and the cost really isn't relevant at that time. So population didn't seem to be the issue either. If you take Whitman County is a huge county. And if you looked at land area, they would pay disproportionate amounts. Same thing with population, so on and so forth. So it was finally decided that the most equitable way of looking at this was to look at the 5 entities that were either the original interlocal agreement entities, Whitman County, Pullman, and Washington State University, and the 2 contract entities, which were City of Moscow and Asotin County. There also provides services to the Nez Perce tribe, but that is a different arrangement, and they aren't part of that group that has at least a position on the board. So, start off with simple math, divide the costs of Whitcom, the budget, by 5, and split it up 20% each. That sounded good to us. However, the 3 ILA entities provide services in kind to Whitcom. I believe that WSU provides personnel services, pay services. City of Pullman provides technical and accounting services, and Whitman County provides administrative services and, I believe, grants management, if I'm correct. Be that as it may, they put a group together of the finance people from each of these entities, and we looked at those services and looked at the financing model and determined what that value was. So we determined that out of the 100% of cost to run Whitcom, approximately 2.5% of those expenses were reflected by those services provided in kind. So those 3 entities providing those services were given a credit, if you will, of 2.5%. Now, because of the agreement, Whitman County in the plurality, including Pullman and WSU, is referred to as Whitman County, and they pay 57.5% of the costs of Whitcom. The other, I guess it'd be 42.5%, is split between City of Moscow and Asotin County. Now, those amounts, because neither Asotin County or City of Moscow provide those in-kind services, seem to be a fair calculation of how to split up the cost. Now, the question becomes, 21.5% or 21.25% is Moscow's share of what? And what it is a share, and I'm sorry this is so small, a share of Whitcom's budget. So if you look up here, and I'd be happy to provide this to you, it's a draft budget. We are on a different fiscal year than Washington entities, but we looked at, everybody had their budget set essentially for the first year. Then the second year, the costs of implementing the new program would kick in and needed to become sustainable. So the Whitcom board went through and worked with Whitcom administration, and I know Captain Lanier was a big part of that, and came up with a proposed budget for the FY 22 fiscal year. So as you'll see from so like I said, I can provide you a copy of this if you like. But as you can see from this, if I can get my pointer out. There it is. Make sure they can still hear me. Okay, so if you look up here, these are fiscal years, fiscal 2021, 22, 23, 24, 25. The reason that we have 5 years is because we originally had wanted to move. Is this live or not? No, I'll turn it up.
Here, you want this one?
I think he's getting me on. You okay? Okay, as I mentioned, sorry I was off the mic for a minute. So we had 5 years because we were originally trying to negotiate a 5-year agreement to get as much consistency and predictability as we could. Because we wanted some different things in the agreement, one of those was we would like, if we're going to be an equal partner in Whitcom, Moscow and Asotin County would like to have an additional seat on the board. As I indicated, prior to 2015, we had a seat on the board, but only as a non-voting ex officio member. So the 2015 agreement gave us that 1 seat. However, Whitcom is a board of 6. It was a board of 6, and those were the ILA entities, Whitman County, WSU, and Pullman. When 2015, it became a board of 8 with 1 representative from Asotin County and 1 representative from the City of Moscow. Again, when you're setting budgets and the fees you're paying are relevant to the budget or to the budget that is adopted, you want to be able to have a meaningful representation on the board. And I want to say that the Whitcom board has always been amenable to any ideas from the City of Moscow or Asotin County. Been very pleased with that relationship. And Actually, in 2015, the Pullman City Supervisor at the time, John Sherman, approached me with the idea of having a voting position on the board, which was a great, I thought it was a very meaningful way of collaboration. So we weren't able to come to an agreement on a full 5 years, mainly because people wanted to see how it worked. The first year, fiscal 2021, this is what is in our budget right now, $674,942. And because Whitcom had some reserves, those sorts of things, those are being used to finance the new model of compensation, so on and so forth. It really starts to kick in fiscal 2022. And I will tell you that the increase to Moscow and Asotin County was small compared to the increase that was going to be coming out of the 3 ILA entities, mainly because their funding had been very stable. They had a huge amount of money coming from the state. As you can see, if you start looking at pass-through funding and user fee funding, user fee funding is, pass-through is like grants and things like that. User fees are what you get paid in taxes, so on and so forth. Moscow doesn't have really a huge amount of grant funding. We have user fees, that's about it. The rest of the funding comes from, in fact, that $250,000 represents landline 911 as well as cellular 911. The rest of this is general fund money. And so our funding is a little bit different from that from the state of Washington. So based on that, you can see there is an increase from 674,942 to 717,653. And this is the first year that restructuring kicks in. And so that's why you see the increases. They level off very quickly after that. So they stay really stable after that is done. But there had to be a day of reckoning for all of the entities involved in Whitcom at that time. So that kind of explains, and this was the subject of months and months of negotiations and discussions. As late as August and September, we were still talking. There were still entities that really liked that call volume model or the population model. So this is what we were able to agree to come to. Always more comfortable behind a podium. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are the things that we would like in the future. We'd like a multiple year agreement rather than the 2-year that you have before you today. We'd also like that additional seat on the Whitcom Governing Board. In discussing this with the board and with Wendy Barrett, the ILA entities, WSU, Pullman, and Whitman County will be meeting sometime in the future and discuss that. There's been no real pushback on it. I think everybody wants to make this work and keep it viable. I think the one thing that runs through this agreement is that there really are economies of scale for having a joint dispatch center. Running your own dispatch center, all 5 of these entities separately, the cost would be huge because the cost of the infrastructure does not go down proportionally with the volume of calls. Lastly, we like a standard calculation of yearly fees, which we have now. You saw the 5-year model. After that one initial jump, it levels off for the next 4 years. So with that, the contract that you have before you is the latest iteration of the draft. It is a 2-year agreement. It is looking forward to negotiation of a longer agreement. I do agree that, and again, I accept responsibility for not having a signed agreement before the end of 2020, but the Whitcom Board, Executive Director, and as advised the Council on the 16th, we were working toward that, and there was never any inclination or inkling that we were ever not going to have a relationship with Whitcom. So, with that, I would certainly answer any questions that you may have. Or Chief Fry and Captain Lanier would as well.
Art, do you have any questions?
No, I don't.
Ann, do you have any questions?
I'm going to pose this question to Gary, but it might be better for Chief Fry or Captain Lanier. So can you just address some of the questions and concerns about reliability that have been brought up, or personnel, a little more in depth than what has been touched on already?
Before you answer that, is anybody going to want to see any more of the PowerPoint, or can we go back to the view of the
Let me just ask a couple questions off of this, if you don't mind, and just not to leapfrog you.
Go
In
for it.
terms of standard calculations, at some point you were talking about, it was basically a standard 3% increase. Is
Yes.
that kind of what we're looking for, is just an idea that says if you give people raises, the cost of running it is like 3%, or is that what we're looking for?
It could be, but as you know, your cost for personnel goes up and down based on how many you have, how many openings you have, those sorts of things. So actually, it's the annual budget that makes the most difference. Again, if there are entities, for instance, not calculated in that calculation is Nez Perce Tribe. If Nez Perce Tribe continues to be a contractor, getting contracted services, that could affect it too, and it could actually drive our costs lower. So those are all things that are up in the air because we can't contract for another entity. We can only contract for ourselves.
So I understand that this year we went over the expiration date, which was in December. The question I have is, in future contracts, should we have something there that says, while we're under negotiations, the contract will stay in effect, or something similar to that? Just because at this point you have a great relationship with Whitcom. There could come a day when you don't have a great relationship with Whitcom, and they could just play hardball and suddenly say, December 31st, Moscow, you're cut off. And so I wondered whether or not in future contracts it may be
Certainly, we
helpful.
could put something in there that says that the contract will continue as long as the parties are in active negotiation. Part of the issue, and it's a drafting issue that I don't particularly like. When I draft contracts, if you put things like that in there, people tend to not treat it as a real deadline. And if you say, okay, it'll go year to year until a new contract is, pretty soon you're 5 years into a
Right.
year-to-year contract and you haven't taken the time to deal with it. But certainly we can put some language in there so that there's no question that we're not going to get kicked to the curb.
Well, because even right now that we don't have it in the contract, it appeared to me that someone else had a contract that expired a year ago and they were still negotiating with that.
That was Asotin County, and same situation we were in. They were looking at, okay, how is this being done? They had some new staff or elected officials in Asotin County, so they were kind of figuring out what they were doing as well.
And thank you for letting me leapfrog
Okay,
you.
I think we're ready to stop screen sharing. Thanks, Dave.
No problem.
I guess I could have clicked that.
No, that's fine.
There you go.
Does somebody want to address Ann's question about reliability?
Yeah, I can do it. So Ann, I'm assuming you're talking about from the personnel perspective and not from equipment and radio reliability. Is that correct? You're on mute.
Second time today. You'd think that I'd be used to it by now. But no, I just asked Gary because I don't know if you all were included in the email. I don't think so, but we just got a question about that in general. So I wanted to bring it up during our meeting as well.
Sure, yeah. So it's no secret that Whitcom has had some personnel struggles. One of the things that we tried to do during the 6 or so months that I was over there was not just look at the contract. This was just one small thing. And just to back up a little bit, and maybe to defend Gary's honor just a little bit, I don't think Whitcom would have been ready on their end to do a contract by the end of this year too. We knew that the contract was probably going to expire. We knew that Asotin was working on a contract that was expired. This was a very complicated issue trying to come up with a funding model that was repeatable from year to year. The previous director had spent a couple years working on that. So the timeline that we're on to get this done really was pretty aggressive if you think about it. I mean, we didn't even start looking at it until March of last year. But to your question, yes, Whitcom has had some real instability with personnel. They were down, I think, 10 dispatchers at one point, which is almost 50% of their floor dispatchers. So that's really hard when it comes to staffing. They still work under some mandatory overtime issues. One of the things that we tried to do was just look at the entire operation from their hiring process to their training process and put some consistency in it. They had a really high failure rate in the training program, which was a function of 4 or 5 trainers training 4 or 5 different ways and no standardization. So undoubtedly there were some good dispatchers that weren't able to make the training program because the training program didn't provide consistency. On top of that, just in the operation itself, you have 5 different police agencies or law enforcement agencies and literally 5 different ways of doing the same thing. And so from an operations perspective, it's really, really hard when a dispatcher has to learn one way for Moscow and another way for Sote and another way for Pullman. So Wendy has been really good at trying to address some of those things. They are definitely on the path to stability. I've still been working with them on revamping their training program and flipping it over to an actual recognized training model with some consistency. It's going to be real similar to Moscow's model, which is a nationally recognized called the San Jose model. So we think on that end, they're going to be able to more effectively train dispatchers in a shorter amount of time and more comprehensively. And as far as the operations, Wendy's already put some things in place that provides consistency among agencies. So when a dispatcher goes from one agency to another on the radio console, they're doing the same job. They're not doing 5 different jobs because there's 5 different law enforcement agencies. The results have been immediate and apparent to us on the user end of things. I'm not going to say, just speaking from law enforcement, that every agency is happy with some of the changes, but they have made Whitcom more efficient, and I think that trend will continue. So from the user end, I'm very happy with the direction that they're going, and I think as far as a product, if you look at dispatching as a product, it's a quality product.
Thank you for all of that really helpful information. Do you know what their staffing levels are right now?
I think right now,
slots.
Yeah, I think right now they're down 6. Well, actually, they're down 8 on the floor. I think they have 2 in training and about 6 additional openings. There's also, of course, Wendy getting promoted, and then the trickle down from that was a net loss or a net break even, I guess. And then, if you lose even one dispatcher in the training program, it sets you back several months. You typically don't know if they're going to fail until they reach the later phases. And in a 20-ish week training program, you've invested a significant amount of time in that one dispatcher to lose that dispatcher. So they're definitely going the right direction, but it's at a snail's pace when it comes to increasing actual personnel.
Thank you for all of that info and for your time as the interim
responder
as well. That's it for me.
I'd like to say that I would really support the idea of us having 2 bodies on the board, because the board ends up looking at personnel issues. They also pick the executive director. They do a lot of that stuff. And if we're all paying pretty much comparable with respect to the amount of money everyone's paying, money and services, that it would make sense that we would have 2 persons as well.
I agree with that sentiment.
Certainly pass that on.
Can I ask you another question? What does it mean under Section 2, description of services to be provided? There's something that says after our emergency public works request. I'm not sure what that means.
I believe, now,
I
could have the public works guys chime in here. If there is something that happens after 5 o'clock, if there is a sewer backup or something like that, that they would dispatch out that public works response.
Okay. So that's when you were talking previously about, in addition to just 911 calls, they also call about sewers and other such things. Thank you very much.
Roger, is that correct?
Yeah, there's actually 2 components to that. One is, yes, they do those call outs for us after hours. And then 2, we asked a couple years ago for our public works folks to check in on the radio so that because we get the call in the middle of the night when they're working on a water main break that, hey, there's somebody digging in my yard. So it was beneficial for us that our dispatch center knew we had public works folks out and they were going to be on the radio.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Any further questions for staff?
No, I just have to say, from my own perspective, it seems to me that a lot of the issues that we've had with them have really been addressed, and the last year has been very busy. And we appreciate everybody's efforts to step in and take over.
Thank you very much. What is your direction on going to council?
Okay, I mean, my proposal is it should go back to all of council, my sense. I think that it shouldn't go on the consent agreement. What do you think, Ann?
I support that.
Is there a consensus approval?
Yes.
There's a consensus approval. Yes.
Recommendation for approval. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, reports. Our favorite, the farmer's market.
Okay, can everyone see that okay, hopefully?
Yes.
Great. Afternoon, everyone. So the farmer's market is roughly 3-4 months out, and we're in the midst of trying to plan another potentially uncertain year before us with the repercussions of COVID following us into 2021. And so part of what we do in January is, in early January, actually put out an application to local performers and folks to come play the farmers market. And so we put together a few contingency plans. I'll just go ahead and read them for anyone that needs it to be read, because it might be tiny on their screen. So option 1, we do not offer live market entertainment. That is what happened last year. We nixed that amenity from the farmers market. Option 2, we're looking at potentially offering market entertainment with some restrictions based off of best practices of what we're seeing. We're looking at additional safety measures, what that could look like, buffer zones between the performers and patrons. And then there's some sub-options here of what that also could look like. Do we include both music time slots, only one time slot where it's unpaid, or the paid one? And then option 3 is everything's back to normal, hunky-dory, people are ready to party and have a good time. So what you would typically see at the market, both time slots functioning correctly and properly, chairs out for people to sit and enjoy, and then all of these options are predicated on what is happening in our local community. Is our public health order still in effect? What does the Idaho North Central Public Health District have to say? What's going on at the state level? And it's also, I would like to point out, none of these options would necessarily be set for the entire market season. So, maybe May and June, we're looking at option 1. Maybe July, we move forward to option 2. So these are graduated approaches to what entertainment could look like coming back at the market, just like we had a graduated reopening last season, where June was very restricted, and then we got back closer to a fuller market towards the end of 2020. So I'm happy to leave this up if people would like to refer to it, but you should all have it in your packets, if I'm not mistaken. And I'd be happy to stop the screen share and answer any questions about these options we've put together. Not hearing any objections to stop the screen share.
Yeah, I don't have any. You cleverly anticipated the questions that I had and got them answered during the presentation.
Great. Ann, do you have any questions?
No, just I appreciate that you're staying flexible, recognizing, of course, that we don't know how things are going to change, but that all of the listed out options are great to see.
Yep. It seemed to me it's similar to our whole concept of a metric system, and it kind of sets up the metrics, and if we hit this level, then we do this, and having the gradations makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and we would probably be coming back to council, a committee, and then on to council closer to the start of market, maybe about a month out, when we kind of have a better idea. But again, we know things can change on a dime. We would like to bring market entertainment back. There's a lot of benefits that it provides to sort of the market and the vendors who are trying to conduct business and, morale of the community. But we also recognize that it has to be at the right time and done safely and done correctly. So, great. No further questions?
Thank you very much for the update.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, nice. We like your proactive approach. The arts.
Culture Day here at Public Works Finance. Let's see if I can do this.
I don't think you shared.
I didn't. Let's try that again. Okay.
So go back to the Zoom window. Click share.
Thanks. Okay. Now we're cooking with gas. Okay. Thank you for your time today. I want to give a presentation on the arts programming for 2021. As we all know, we've all talked about it at length. 2020 presented a lot of challenges. One thing that I wanted to open with is that there were a lot of the sort of obstacles and limitations forced us to recognize some opportunities. I'm in no way saying that COVID is a good thing, but it did help us to develop some more flexibility in some of our programs that I think will be really beneficial to those programs going forward. So a couple of things that I wanted to highlight before we get to the big event type programs for the year. This is just a snapshot of our programs in chronological order. We do, of course, we'll spend some time talking about Art Walk because that's one of the larger events of the year. But we have all kinds of stuff going on. And I wanted to spend a minute on the modifications that we are anticipating for each one. So right now in the gallery, we've got Dear Moscow is up, and that's something that we've been able to offer online galleries using our content management system. That software is called Submittable, and it's been a really indispensable tool for us in this really challenging time. So that shows up right now, but we will, and we have not been able to open it to the public in person, but we will once City Hall reopens. At this time, there's no plan to have an artist reception. A similar situation with the poetry relay, which is something that's planned for April. April is National Poetry Month, so that event is something that would typically be taking place in April. At this point, we don't project that we'll be able to do an in-person event, but we'll do either a video reading or some kind of print delivery. Similar story is going on with Silver and Gold. That's a show that's coming up in the gallery. No artist reception planned at this time, and we are actively soliciting registrations, and those registrations include submissions for an online gallery. So we're already setting up for both options. Some of you might be familiar with the Activities Toolbox or have seen some stuff about that online. It's a new feature that we really started in response to COVID, and also has been valuable as an arts education option for people in the community. That's all low contact, online registration and low contact pickup. When we start to look at Art Walk, now we're getting into June, and there's this kind of limbo land where we don't really know what's going to be happening at that time. So we have an idea for the art to be featured in host locations only, rather than having the full street fair that we're familiar with Art Walk. I'll spend a little bit more time on that in a minute. Next up in our calendar would be entertainment in the park. We have options for limited audience and assigned seating. That depends on what's needed at the time. In July through October, Control P is a printmaking show, so it's printmaking in the 21st century. In that instance, we are still planning to have the online gallery option because we don't know what's going to go on. We're going to be soliciting registrations anyway. We may as well do it that way. And I think we can probably plan to have an artist reception in this space in September for that show. By the time we get to Palouse Plein Air in September, I gotta think we're able to put cookies on trays and welcome people into these spaces that we're so lucky to fill with artwork. So that's just a chronological look at all of the programs that we're presenting this year. And if we do find when we get to Palouse Plein Air in September that we do need to introduce those flexibilities that we used in 2020, we'll go ahead and do that. We've explored that territory, so we've got options. Okay, so just to recap, in Third Street Gallery, we've got online registration and artist agreements. Legal has been really helpful in helping us to facilitate all online legal documents. File sharing is a lot easier for us now because of Submittable. Same thing with a publicly viewable gallery. There's been some staff impact in setting these things up, but really on balance, there's been an incredible time savings with that software. The physical installations are accessible when City Hall is open. Even when that's the case, we have in the last exhibition open to only a small number of visitors in the gallery at a time. Masks are required. And then some folks have asked about virtual artist receptions, and that seems to be not really a priority at this time. That's kind of a difficult, that's a really difficult experience to replicate in the online space, which is unfortunate because I think we're all craving seeing other people. So that's our schedule moving through 2021. We'll see 4 exhibitions in the space, and we've gotten creative about delivery of those, and it's really exciting to see everybody bringing their artwork forward. Okay, Art Walk, this is probably the big one on everyone's mind. And the concerns about hosting Art Walk, as usual, if I had to sum it up, is to say, we don't know what's going to happen. So state and national vaccination efforts may not achieve target population immunity, and same to say about local vaccination efforts. We're not sure what's going to have happened at that point. Also, the Main Street Fair component of Art Walk it's all about congregation. It is all about interaction. This is a conversation that we had about Art Walk in, I think it was April of last year, that it is a congregational event. And the other thing that we've looked at really carefully is that when we as event planners make decisions, in our city staff capacity, there's an awareness that those decisions and recommendations have an impact on what other arts organizations do. And so we want to be very careful to put forward the example that council feels is appropriate. So this is really the concern. We don't know what's going to happen. And so the adaptation proposal, I'll start on the left-hand side of that screen first, and then we'll get to the whys. So this is a model that we have been playing with as a way to present the event without having those congregational elements that are a concern. It would feature visual, literary, performing, and culinary artists in host locations, but omitting those Main Street events. We would obviously need to make a recommendation about a reduced registration fee for that shift. The Main Street events bring a lot of people downtown, and so I think in recognition of the removal of that element, we would need to make an adjustment to, or at least bring to council a proposal to reduce those fees. And then also, if we are doing a fee reduction, we would simplify promotions and other event elements to balance out the revenue to expense, essentially, of offering Art Walk in a modified manner. Okay, I think the whys are really important, and I'll be happy to take questions on this in a little bit. So why didn't we do this last year? So that's a valid question. I think the main piece of it is that last year when council made the call on Art Walk, we didn't have masks in place. And so I think that's a really, really essential part. Secondly, the businesses are used to handling customer visits with masks. They've got their sanitation protocols in place now in a way that in April of last year, everybody was still figuring out how to do this. Now we kind of, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you analyze it, everybody's kind of got this wired. People have figured out how to welcome people into their businesses, or how to maintain appropriate sanitation. And the businesses can choose to participate or not. There may be some that say, we're going to sit it out for a year, and that's absolutely okay. But we wanted to create something that was an option. So I think those are the two main reasons that we didn't do an adapted event for last year. There was still just so much up in the air. Why can't we decide later? Another great question. Part of this is about the planning for Art Walk really should be starting now. Booking bands, doing street closure, mapping the event, soliciting art demonstrators and vendors, all of the Main Street events. That's something that really starts being planned at this time of the year. And so it's Art Walk's a cruise ship, it's not a sports car, it doesn't turn on a dime, right? So we need, 2019, we got rained out for 3 of the 4 concerts or events in the park. So we've mitigated that. The Moscow Public Library has been a longstanding partner in this event, and the shift to the first Thursdays in July really works very well for their schedule. And then we were careful to chat with all of the organizations in town that have events in the park. Largely, we talked to Rendezvous, and then U of I Theater Department has some events in the park at that time too. So this event is moving to the first 2 Thursdays in July. Something else that we're looking at with entertainment in the park is booking. So typically, the hands down most popular entertainer for entertainment in the park is the Reptile Man. And so you guys have seen these hundreds of children come out, and the whole deal is that we get to gather around the big turtle and touch the big turtle and experience each other experiencing the reptiles, right? Very congregational. Same thing with Radical Rick. Radical Rick is it's radical science. And so these are very interactive performers, and these are the ones that work really well for our partners at the library. They're really great for the kids, great turnout for these. So I think what we would be looking for 2021 is to move more toward musical presentations, because everybody's sitting in their seats, ostensibly. But with a younger audience, they may have to stand up and get their wiggles out, but it's less of a welcoming the kids down to the stage to play with the animals. So that's that's on the booking and scheduling side. Front of house, we're thinking about audience in social distancing circles. That's one option. So this would work if there are restrictions on events, attendee size or audience size. The masks will still be required. Sorry, that should say public health emergency order, if that public health emergency order is still in effect. We imagine those social distancing circles being the size of a family, basically like a 6-foot circle that we would paint in chalk paint on the grass. And then option number 2 is no seating restrictions. So if we get to July and we find that everything's fine, and on July 1st, we're able to welcome everybody to the park and have no restrictions, then that's exactly what we'll do. And that's really the roundup of all of our event adaptations that we have planned so far for this year, and I'd be happy to take questions.
You've been busy.
Yeah, yes, we're trying to consider all the contingencies.
I just want to comment on the total adaptability that you have really come up with respect to Plan 1, Plan 2, and how do you keep moving through those, so thank you. Art, any comments?
So kudos to you, the commission, and the others who participated here to look forward as to what we might anticipate, what we might get done, and also to incorporate so much flexibility into your plans to enable potentially fairly last-minute changes to things.
Yeah.
So really good. Kudos all around.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a good exercise in flexibility. I'm excited to have that. I'm excited to have that muscle sort of, I think that it's going to be good going forward to maintain that, sort of inquisitive. Appreciate that.
Anne?
Yeah, I did have one question. What types of venues are you imagining for Art Walk? Is it, because normally it's all over the place, but you're talking about specifying which ones. Do you have an idea yet of where those will be?
I don't think I wouldn't recommend specifying certain venues. Obviously open to staff and council input on that. I think the intent would be to open registration and to allow any business to self-select and decide if that event style works for them this year. So I wouldn't want to get involved in limiting who participates as a host location unless directed to do so by council. It seems like the businesses probably have a really good sense of that.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, because in my mind it was like designated in as the way it was presented. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. If I present again, I'll be sure to clarify that. Thank you.
Like I said, I just want to say at the end, I'm looking out there and I see Amanda as well, and it's so impressive to see how well all the commissions have adapted to COVID and the uncertainties. And so thank you, both Amanda and Megan.
Thanks.
And this year feels more optimistic, I think, just because we know what we're dealing with and it's not this unprecedented thing. So I feel like that's reflected in your work, and I'm excited about the months ahead.
Thanks.
Thank you. Meeting adjourned. Does anybody have any move? Okay, Ann, you agree? We're adjourned? Thank you.
Bye.